this is a good point to make, a point that I think you're hearing in this conversation that we haven't stated between us yet, which is there are many things in here that we are discussing between us that are very much in family conversations, but we are not losing sight as we talk about this about what we share in common in the midst of those differences. And what we share in common are the biggest truths that the Bible has to offer us. There is coming a day when peace and righteousness will be established, when reconciliation will happen, when Jesus will rule over all the earth, where everyone will recognize who he is. There's a victory coming that makes any trauma that we go through now in the midst of a fallen world worth it, because it's all going to be resolved by God in the end, all those things. And so what has been in the past oftentimes a battleground between Christians can just be a nice little eschatological playground that we can talk about with one another and engage with one another, recognizing, yeah, you may put that together differently than I do, but let's step back and not forget that on the big things, we are actually one voice.
And my one footnote to that, a long footnote, is that unfortunately at the popular grassroots level, and since last October we've seen it again, there still is a popular notion in a lot of American Christian circles, not limited to traditionally dispensationalist ones, but particularly within them, that takes hope for Israel as a nation in the future to mean we must, in our politics, in our theology, support the current state of Israel, right or wrong. And I know Daryl doesn't believe that, but I run into him every week. And so at that level, the conversation takes on a little more meaning, because if I were to grant every dispensationalist premise, I would still go back to the Old Testament and to the Mosaic Law and see everything that Israel will be judged by. Prominent among them is, are they treating the foreigner in their midst as an equal? Well, obviously, none of the current conflict would have happened had there been a little more justice in Gaza and the West Bank.
Yeah, the trick about the current application is, of course, that what gets framed as a two-way conversation between Palestinians and Israelis is actually a three-way conversation in which you have Iran and proxies at work, and who believe that Israel doesn't have the right to exist in the Middle East, which complicates everything. It's hard to have a conversation at the peace table when one of the partners at the peace table says to another partner at the peace table, you really don't have the right to be here. And so that complicates the situation in the Middle East. Israel feels like she's under existential threat, and from some she is. And then my very crass line about the Middle East goes like this. Most people think it's a two-way conversation. It's actually a threesome, and threesomes don't work.
And you could probably argue that it's at least a four or a five-some, because you've got Russia trying to figure out who they want to support for their own interests, and China doing the same thing.
That's right. And when you hear discussions of some people who are rightly concerned for the rights and injustices that Palestinians are suffering, what you often don't hear in the same breath, but needs to be there, is that there are some people in that conversation who have a jihadist agenda against Israel.
Yeah.
And when that is absent in the conversation lacks balance.
Good. That's very helpful. So, Dr. Blomberg, can you echo the sentiments that Dr. Bach was saying earlier about how this is a sort of an interfamily, intramural dialogue?
Sure.
How would you think about disagreements on these issues? We're not in the first tier here. I don't know if we're in the second tier. Maybe we're in the third tier on some of these things. But how do you understand our ability to disagree well, and how can we do better about that?
One of the absolutely most rewarding things that I have done in my ministry came back in the very early 1990s during the Gulf War, where a colleague at Denver Seminary who was a dispensationalist and I were both attending the same church, and the pastor asked us if we would um, jointly share the sermon and turn it into a dialogue. He might have used the word debate, and talk about our differing views on this. And we liked each other, and we didn't want it to sound like a debate, but wanted it to sound like a dialogue. And I think it succeeded. And when we finished, um, there were just bunches of people who said things like, "That was great. Why can't we do that more often? Why can't Christians talk to each other, even in public, even about some somewhat important things that they differ on, and show that they still like each other and they're not bad mouthing each other?" And so over the years, when I have had opportunities to do something like that, and not just on this topic, I jump at the opportunity because it's not modeled enough.
Good.
Well, thank you guys for helping us to model that kind
Very
of civil
appreciate
discourse amongst brothers. Have you? Go ahead, Bob.
Well, I was going to say that's one of the things I think we're trying to do in this series we're doing on eschatology, is understanding that there's good people that hold different positions on this topic.